In the quiet streets of London, beneath the fog that clung to the lamps and the stones, an old woman walked slowly. Her garments were tattered remnants of former glory, yet her eyes were lined with heavy kohl, her head still crowned with plumes and tarnished jewels. Passers-by turned, some in amusement, others in unease, but all unable to look away. For even in decline, she commanded the gaze. She was Luisa Casati, once the brightest scandal of Europe, now a shadow glimmering faintly at the edges of memory. Welcome, kind listener. Share with me when and where you are listening, and let us weave a global memory together. Please subscribe so this wandering tale may continue. The story begins long before the streets of London, in the palaces of Venice, where light moved across marble walls as though carrying secrets from centuries past. Luisa Aman was born in January of 1881 into a world already thick with mystery. Her father, Alberto Aman, was a wealthy industrialist whose fortune was rooted in cotton, and her mother Lucia was of quiet nobility. She was not born into the fragile poverty of some dreamers, nor into the rigid austerity of ancient aristocracy, but into that strange mixture of commerce and tradition where gold allowed imagination to take shape. As a child, she wandered through the echoing rooms of her family's home, surrounded by statues, tapestries, and the faint scent of incense. Servants moved silently like shadows. The air was heavy with the memory of generations, though her own was destined to be cut short of parental protection. Her mother died when Luisa was only 13, and her father soon followed. Death came softly but relentlessly, and in those losses she inherited not only a vast fortune, but also the eerie silence of empty rooms. One might wonder what it is like for a girl to stand among towering marble columns with no parents, no guiding hand, and yet every treasure at her disposal. Does such solitude feed the imagination, or does it hollow the heart? She became, with her sister, one of the richest heiresses of Italy. But wealth without the warmth of family often breeds a hunger that no banquet can satisfy. The Venetian palaces seemed to whisper to her, urging her toward invention, spectacle, and transformation, as though the walls themselves longed to see life break the stillness. Her childhood memories, though draped in luxury, were tinged with a kind of ghostly pallor. Candlelight flickered across statues that seemed to move when she turned away. The sound of oars dipping into the lagoon outside her window carried a rhythm both soothing and haunting. She might have felt the vastness of her fortune as a chain rather than a liberation, for with money comes not only freedom, but the burden of creating meaning where none is given. Those who looked at her as a young girl could not have foreseen the figure she would become, painted, sculpted, immortalized, or ruined, and yet, perhaps in the quiet sorrow of those early years, her longing for spectacle was already kindling. As she grew into adolescence, she revealed little of the scandalous woman she would later be. By accounts, she was shy, with wide eyes that drank in the world around her. But sometimes shyness is only the veil of an inner fire, waiting for the right spark. When her father's will secured her wealth, she became, in a sense, untethered. With no parents to impose direction and no desperate need to marry for stability, her life lay open, a canvas upon which she could paint as she pleased. Yet in Venice, tradition still hung heavy, and the palaces looked down upon their heirs with solemn expectation. A young heiress might be adorned and admired, but she was expected to tread carefully, to choose a husband, to secure a lineage. Did she already feel the suffocating pull of such expectations? One imagines her gazing at her reflection in the dim light, imagining not the dutiful lady of society, but something stranger, grander, freer. The world beyond her windows was changing. Italy, at the turn of the century, was a country struggling with identity, caught between the grandeur of its past and the uncertainty of modern industry. In such a climate, The eccentric often becomes a mirror of collective unrest. Perhaps Luisa's soul, unanchored by family, was naturally drawn to excess, as though she could answer personal emptiness with the creation of spectacle. In the soft echoes of those early Venetian nights, she began to imagine herself not merely as a woman, but as a living tableau. There is something in the orphaned heart that seeks permanence. Some search for it in devotion, others in lineage, still others in art. Luisa seemed destined to search for it in herself, by transforming her own body and life into the canvas upon which dreams and nightmares could be projected. Her fortune allowed her to escape the strictures that might have bound another, yet it also isolated her. For what companions can truly understand the loneliness of wealth when it is accompanied by silence? Perhaps this is why she would later fill her homes with animals, masks, and endless parties, as if to drown out the whispers of marble and shadow. The candle that flickered in her hand as a child would later become the torch by which she illuminated salons, gardens, and stages, turning night into a theater of her own making. But in those first years, she was only beginning to feel the pull of destiny. To look at the young Luisa then was to see an heiress of immense fortune, a Venetian girl with quiet eyes and solemn dress. Yet within, the desire for transformation was already forming, waiting to erupt. Her childhood ended not in the comfort of a parent's embrace, but in the lonely corridors of inheritance. It is no wonder, then, that she would later choose to shock, to dazzle, to reinvent, because for her, the greatest scandal of all might have been to live quietly. And so the candle flickers in that silent room, the young heiress watching its flame bend and straighten in the draught. Shadows grow and collapse against marble walls. In her gaze, one can almost sense the questions forming, though she would never speak them aloud. If life is fleeting, why not burn as brightly as possible? If death comes without warning, why not leave behind a vision that cannot be forgotten? The flame trembles, and her eyes reflect its restless light. The sound of muffled footsteps on marble floors lingers, as though the weight of destiny itself is pacing through corridors, seeking her. Those steps, half real and half imagined, carried Luisa away from the silence of orphanhood and into the threshold of adulthood, where society awaited with all its expectations. In 1900, at the age of 19, she married Marchese Camillo Casati Stampa di Soncino, a union that merged her immense wealth with an old noble lineage. The marriage promised her not only security but also a title, and she became Marchesa Luisa Casati. Yet titles are not always crowns of freedom. Sometimes they are chains of invisible gold. Rome opened itself to her, its salons and boulevards offering a stage far larger than the Venetian palaces of her childhood. She walked among marble statues that seemed even heavier with history than those of her youth. Roman society, with its stiff rituals and murmured judgments, studied her carefully. To most, she was simply another young noblewoman, required to attend dinners, to host gatherings, to show her jewels, and to smile at the right moments. Her husband Camillo was a man of decent standing, not cruel, but neither remarkable nor visionary. He expected her to perform her role as Marchesa with grace and predictability, but Luisa was never destined for predictability. In those early years of marriage, the gilded salons must have felt to her like cages of polished bronze. Imagine her seated at a long table beneath heavy chandeliers, her fingers brushing the silver cutlery, her eyes watching the flicker of candles across velvet curtains. Conversation was polite, structured, and repetitive. Guests whispered of politics, of inheritance, of commerce. For some, such life was sufficient, even enviable, but for Luisa, it was suffocation, masked in perfume. Behind the courtesy of her smile, a deeper hunger stirred, the hunger to be seen not as a hostess or wife, but as something elemental, as a force rather than a role. Her daughter Cristina was born in 1901, a delicate presence who might have anchored another woman into maternal devotion. But for Luisa, motherhood was a distant, difficult realm, one she could not fully inhabit. Some whispered she was careless, even neglectful. Others suggested she loved her child in her own strange, detached way. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. Her love expressed less in daily tenderness than in a restless wish to create a life that was art, even if that art was not one her daughter could easily share. What is certain is that Cristina was raised largely apart from her mother, and this distance would remain a shadow across their bond. Yet within the hushed rhythms of domestic duty, Luisa's imagination stirred more violently. She began to experiment with appearances, daring touches of clothing and cosmetics that unsettled polite Roman company. A darker shade of eye, a peculiar cut of gown, a strange ornament that seemed more theatrical than fashionable. These were the first ripples of the storm she would become. She understood, even then, that the human form could be a canvas more powerful than any painting, for it breathed, it moved, it unsettled. To step into a salon dressed in a way no one had imagined was to change the air itself, to shift the gaze of all who entered. What did Camillo make of this? He accepted it with weary tolerance, perhaps even bewilderment. He was not a man to seek scandal, but neither did he possess the strength to contain her. Their marriage soon grew into an arrangement of convenience, the form of union without the substance. They separated quietly, though not formally divorced until much later. For Luisa, the departure from conjugal duty was not tragedy, but liberation. Freed from the confinement of expectation, she set her sights on a new identity, one that could never again be bound by husband or family. But before she could declare herself a living work of art, she had to learn the delicate balance between eccentricity and ruin. Rome provided her first lessons. Imagine her standing at the window of her home, watching the carriages roll past, the evening bells sounding from distant churches. The city was alive with ancient echoes and modern murmurs, a place where the ruins of emperors coexisted with the gossip of aristocrats. She must have felt herself pulled between those two worlds, the grandeur of Rome's immortal past and the triviality of its present rituals. Which would she serve? The answer soon revealed itself. She would serve neither. She would serve only herself, but not in the sense of selfishness. Rather, she would serve the vision she carried within her, the vision of life itself as theater. There are moments in every story where the line between duty and desire begins to dissolve. For Luisa, those moments multiplied. Invitations became opportunities, not for conformity, but for performance. If others wore pale gowns, she would arrive in a cloak of peacock feathers. If others painted their lips lightly, she would line her eyes in heavy black, turning them into pools of shadow that unsettled all who met her gaze. The whispers of scandal grew, but so too did the fascination. People might criticize, but they could not turn away, and in that contradiction lay her power. It is said that the marble of Roman salons absorbed her footsteps as though recording them, carrying her presence into memory. One wonders if those stones, ancient and enduring, recognized in her a kinship. For like Rome itself, she was becoming a ruin and a spectacle at once, both decaying and eternal. Did she feel this resonance, or was it only felt by those who watched her? The question lingers unanswered, like perfume after a guest has left the room. Her separation from Camillo widened, and with it the freedom to shape her own destiny. She began to seek out artists, writers, and eccentrics who could match her hunger for invention. She learned to cultivate mystery, to speak little, and appear much. Silence became her instrument, for in silence others projected onto her what they wished to see. She was no longer simply Marchesa Casati, wife of Camillo. She was beginning to become Luisa Casati, the enigma, the living painting, yet every transformation begins in small gestures. In those early years of Roman life, her changes were subtle enough to pass as curiosity, eccentricity, even youthful indulgence. But beneath them lay something more profound, a rejection of the ordinary, of the expected, of the fixed roles society assigned. She began to sense that life could be sculpted as boldly as marble, that a woman could shape herself into myth rather than let myth be assigned to her. The muffled footsteps fade now, dissolving into the hush of velvet curtains and the dim light of candelabras. In the silence that follows, the image of her eyes, darkened with shadow, remains suspended. They are not the eyes of a dutiful Marchesa, nor the eyes of a devoted mother, nor even the eyes of a young woman experimenting with fashion. They are the eyes of someone who has glimpsed a possibility far stranger and far grander, to become not merely a participant in society, but its eternal spectacle. And in that silent gaze, heavy with kohl, the seeds of her scandalous future were already beginning to bloom. The rustle of feathers lingers in the ear, the faint suggestion of wings brushing against velvet, a whisper of movement both delicate and unsettling. It is from this faint sound that Luisa's transformation deepens, for in Rome she had begun to test the boundaries of fashion and presence, but in the years that followed, those experiments turned into acts of deliberate theater. If others saw clothing as a matter of propriety or seasonal taste, she saw it as ritual, as metamorphosis, as the alchemy of turning flesh into image. She was no longer content to wear gowns in the manner of polite society. She chose instead to adorn herself as though stepping into a dream made tangible. She began with small gestures, feathers trailing from her shoulders, jewels fastened in unusual places, fabrics layered in ways that suggested both antiquity and future. But soon, her costumes grew stranger. There were appearances in which she powdered her skin to an unnatural pallor, arriving at gatherings like a figure risen from marble, lips darkened as though stained by night itself. At other times, she dressed in hues so vivid that her presence seemed to ignite the air, the fabrics shimmering with impossible textures. And around her, always, the rustle of feathers, the sound of transformation. Animals became her companions, not as simple pets, but as extensions of her living spectacle. She kept exotic creatures, sometimes walking them through public spaces with the calm assurance of a priestess leading sacred beasts. There were greyhounds with jeweled collars, but also serpents draped across her arms and parrots that screeched in brilliant colors. Most famously, she took to parading leopards on diamond-studded leashes, their sleek forms and burning eyes a reflection of her own hunger for danger and beauty. Imagine the hush that fell upon a Roman street or Parisian boulevard as she appeared, the spotted bodies of leopards moving at her side, the crowd pressing closer, half terrified and half enthralled. She did not need words. Her procession was itself a poem. But behind these eccentric displays was something deeper, almost ritualistic. It was as if she were testing not only the boundaries of fashion, but the very boundaries between human and animal, between mortal and myth. To wear feathers was to summon the spirit of flight. To walk with leopards was to embody predatory grace. To paint her skin and darken her eyes was to erase the ordinary self and become something otherworldly. She was not disguising herself. She was creating herself anew each time, as though her very existence was an endless series of incarnations. Society responded with a mixture of scandal and fascination. Whispers spread quickly. Was she mad? Was she possessed by some ancient spirit? Or was she simply indulging in the caprices that only wealth could sustain? Yet the more people whispered, the more they looked. And the more they looked, the more they became complicit in her transformation. For what is a spectacle without an audience? She knew instinctively that every scandal only deepened her myth, and so she leaned into it, feeding the curiosity of others with ever more daring appearances. Her homes began to reflect her inner world. Rooms were decorated not in the manner of polite taste, but in strange tableaux: animal skins, taxidermy, exotic plants, veils of fabric that filtered light into hues of dream. Guests entered her salons as though entering another realm, where the ordinary laws of taste and proportion no longer applied. She filled spaces with the odd and the uncanny, surrounding herself with objects that carried symbolic weight. To some, it was grotesque, unsettling. To others, it was mesmerizing. To Luisa, it was simply the extension of herself. She had begun to understand that life could be lived not as a sequence of duties, but as a continuous act of creation. Each gesture, each room, each evening was a canvas upon which she could paint her vision. And unlike a painting, which remains fixed, her art was alive, mutable, ephemeral. It vanished into the night but remained etched in the memory of those who witnessed it. She was sculpting her own legend, one feather, one jewel, one leopard at a time. The question arises, was this pursuit a rebellion against the emptiness of her orphaned youth, or was it a hunger innate to her spirit from the beginning? Could she have chosen a quieter path, or was she always destined to chase the horizon of spectacle? The answer cannot be known, for she herself never explained. She rarely justified or analyzed her choices. She simply enacted them, letting silence and vision speak louder than any explanation. But her experiments also carried risk. Eccentricity in small measure can be charming, but in excess it can provoke hostility. She was stepping further and further beyond the safety of social acceptance. Friends were both fascinated and wary. Some drew closer, hoping to bask in her aura, while others retreated, fearing the contamination of scandal. Yet Luisa seemed indifferent to approval or rejection. Her gaze, darkened by coal, was fixed not on the faces of others, but on the invisible horizon of her own becoming. There were nights when her rituals took on an almost mystical quality. Guests spoke of her appearing at gatherings with live snakes twined around her neck, her pale skin gleaming under candlelight, her silence heavy and deliberate. At such moments she seemed less a woman than a priestess, conducting a rite whose meaning none could fully grasp. Did she summon these images from the depths of her imagination? Or was she channeling something older, some ancestral memory of ceremonies lost to time? The air around her seemed charged, as though even the ordinary objects of the room, the glasses, the mirrors, the velvet drapes, were drawn into her performance. And yet, she was not always the predator. There were nights when her attire suggested fragility, her pale figure drifting through salons like a ghost untethered, a soul haunting its own body. These oscillations between ferocity and vulnerability were part of her spell. She refused to be fixed in one identity. She would be many. She would be all. She would be fleeting, yet unforgettable. The rustle of feathers follows her still as she departs into the night, her creatures close, her jewels glinting, her silence deep. Those who watched her that evening would carry the vision for years, retelling it with awe, with disbelief, with envy. She had begun her true work, the work of transforming her life into art, and like all art, it unsettled as much as it enchanted. The feathers settle now, falling silent. Yet in the stillness that follows, there is a sense of anticipation, as though the spectacle has only begun, as though the next act waits just beyond the curtain of night. The scent of turpentine lingers in the air, sharp yet strangely comforting. The fragrance of canvases in the making, of colors ground and mixed, of brushes laid carefully beside palettes. It was within this atmosphere that Luisa Casati stepped into another stage of her transformation. For while she had already begun to shape her life as performance, it was the artists of her time who gave permanence to her fleeting visions. Their canvases caught what the eye saw for only a moment, and in doing so, they ensured that the Marchesa would outlive the fragility of flesh. Among the first was Giovanni Boldini, a painter known for his swirling brushstrokes and his ability to distill elegance into movement. When Luisa sat for him, she did not merely pose. She appeared, she inhabited, she transformed. For Boldini, accustomed to the nobility and the bourgeoisie of Europe, she must have seemed like a creature from another world, less a sitter than an apparition. His brush moved rapidly, almost frantically, to capture the elongated figure, the piercing eyes, the sense of drama that radiated from her, even in stillness. The resulting portrait revealed not only her form, but her myth in the making. To see oneself rendered on canvas is to confront both vanity and mortality. When Luisa beheld Boldini's painting, she must have recognized something both thrilling and unnerving. The woman staring back at her was herself, and yet also not herself. She was heightened, elongated, untethered from the ordinariness of life. In the whirls of paint, she glimpsed her own future, not a life lived quietly, but a legend woven in strokes of color and shadow. Did she feel pride, or did she feel estrangement, seeing herself already half-claimed by myth? Perhaps both. Other artists soon followed. Romaine Brooks captured her in darker tones, evoking the pallor of her skin and the theatrical emptiness of her gaze. Man Ray would later photograph her, transforming her into a surreal figure of contrasts. Augustus John, Kees van Dongen, and countless others found themselves drawn to her presence, not as one might be drawn to a model, but as one is compelled to record a comet passing through the sky. She was never static. She changed from day to day, from hour to hour, and yet each artist believed they had caught some essence of her, a glimpse of the eternal hidden in the ephemeral. But one wonders, was she their muse, or were they her instruments? She submitted to being painted, but in truth, she orchestrated. By appearing as she did, in costumes of feathers, silks, and jewels, by cultivating silence or a sudden glance, she directed the artist's imagination. She offered herself as subject, yes, but also as co-creator. Without her vision, their canvases would not have borne such force. She was both model and author, both object and architect of her image. The studios in which she sat were filled with the peculiar quiet of creation, the scratching of brushes, the faint clink of glass jars, the low murmur of artists giving directions. Into this silence, she carried the rustle of her feathers, the faint growl of an animal waiting outside, the perfume of rare oils. She unsettled the studio as much as she inspired it. To paint her was to paint an interruption, a disturbance, a force that could not easily be contained within frame or pigment. And yet the portraits endure, even as the flesh has long returned to dust. They show us her eyes, dark and elongated, lined with kohl, staring out with a gaze that both invites and refuses. They show her body, elongated into abstraction, draped in silks or cloaked in shadows, caught between elegance and distortion. Each portrait is a fragment of her, a reflection refracted through the artist's vision. No single image captures her entirety, for she herself refused to be whole. She was always many, always shifting. What did it mean to her to see herself so endlessly multiplied? Did she feel immortal, or did she sense the irony that her image was now in the possession of others, owned, bought, sold, hung on walls beyond her reach? For someone who sought to be a living work of art, was it gratifying or diminishing to be fixed on canvas? The ambiguity lingers. Perhaps she accepted it as necessary, another step in the transformation of life into legend. The scent of turpentine clings to these questions, sharp and unfinished. It reminds us that art is never only about the sitter or the artist, but about the space between them, the unspeakable dialogue that flickers in silence. Luisa understood this better than most. She cultivated it, thrived on it. Each time she entered a studio, she was not only being painted, she was painting herself through the eyes of others. Her circle of artists expanded into writers and designers. Poets saw in her the living embodiment of decadence. Fashion designers studied her daring silhouettes, her fearless juxtapositions, drawing inspiration from her ability to merge past and future in a single gown. She became less a woman than a current moving through the veins of European culture. To speak of modernity, of decadence, of spectacle, one had to invoke her name. And still she was restless. The paintings, the poems, the whispers in salons were never enough. She was already thinking beyond the canvas, beyond the studio, toward the grand performances of her later years. Yet these portraits remain as milestones, as silent witnesses of her becoming. Without them, her legend might have faded into memory. With them, she was fixed, multiplied, refracted into eternity. The turpentine fades now, leaving only the faint odor of oil and dust. In the stillness that follows, the image of her face, elongated and pale on Boldini's canvas, hovers like a ghost. Her eyes, lined in shadow, look not at us, but beyond us, towards something unseen. And in that gaze, the next act of her transformation waits, shimmering at the edge of silence. The cry of a peacock pierces the stillness, shrill and haunting, echoing across gardens drenched in moonlight. It is not merely the sound of a bird, but the herald of another transformation. For in the years after her first portraits, Luisa Casati's life blossomed into its most extravagant phase. She had learned the power of image, of presence, and of scandal. Now she would stretch that knowledge to its furthest limits, creating spectacles that blurred the line between private life and theater, between house and stage, between human and myth. Her palaces and villas became laboratories of excess. Visitors entered through gates guarded not by footmen alone, but by strange companions, animals whose presence was both majestic and unnerving. Leopards paced restlessly in gilded collars. Monkeys shrieked from gilded cages. Peacocks spread their feathers across marble staircases, their cries reverberating against vaulted ceilings. Even her hounds, sleek and elegant, seemed chosen less for companionship than for the way their bodies completed the image of their mistress. To step into her home was to abandon the logic of the outside world. Masquerades unfolded nightly. Guests arrived dressed in silks, only to find themselves surrounded by a darkness punctured with sudden bursts of light. Hundreds of candles flickering in candelabras, their wax dripping slowly like time itself. The Marchesa would appear at the height of the evening, emerging not like a hostess, but like a vision summoned by the room. Sometimes she wore gowns woven with metallic threads that shimmered like moonlight captured in fabric. At other times, she draped herself in feathers, beads, and jewels that made her seem less a woman than a living statue of some forgotten goddess. Always her eyes, lined heavily in black, cut through the air like silent commands. There were evenings when she painted her skin with gold, so that under candlelight she gleamed like an idol come to life. Other times she powdered herself to a ghostly pallor, gliding through halls like a revenant from some ancient crypt. And often she wore elaborate headpieces, horns, plumes, crowns of strange design that pushed her beyond humanity into the realm of myth. Guests whispered in awe, in scandal, in disbelief. Was she woman or apparition? Was this fashion or was it ritual? No one could answer. They only watched, entranced, unsettled, unable to look away. Outside her homes, her eccentricity carried into the streets. She was known to walk through Venetian alleys or Roman boulevards at night, accompanied by her leopards or draped in velvet cloaks, her presence causing pedestrians to stop in their tracks. Once, she appeared in the Piazza San Marco at dawn, her eyes painted black, her body wrapped in a live serpent, her silence more startling than any proclamation. Such appearances were not accidents. They were calculated interruptions of the ordinary, reminders that life could be spectacle if one dared to make it so. But such daring carried a price. Every gesture, every outfit, every procession consumed wealth. Her fortune, vast though it was, began to thin under the strain of endless invention. Jewels were purchased, costumes commissioned, animals acquired and maintained, palaces furnished in bizarre splendor. Creditors whispered at the edges of her salons, though few dared to speak too loudly, for now her presence overshadowed all concerns. She was still rich enough to dazzle, and so society tolerated, even celebrated her eccentricities. Yet in the shadows of those candle-lit nights, the first seeds of decline were already being sown. What compelled her to pursue such excess? Was it loneliness, still echoing from the orphaned silence of her youth? Was it a hunger for immortality, the desire to be remembered not as a woman of her time, but as a legend beyond time? Or was it something stranger still, a need to dissolve the boundaries of self, to become something larger, more mysterious, more mythic than the human form allows? Her guests wondered, but she gave no answers. She simply appeared, and her appearance was answer enough. The peacocks remained her truest chorus. Their cries rang out across gardens at twilight, their feathers catching the light of torches and lanterns. They were both beautiful and unsettling, mirrors of their mistress herself. When they fanned their tails, shimmering in iridescence, one could not help but think of Luisa stepping into a room, her garments unfolding in impossible splendor. Like her, they were creatures of display, existing not for function but for spectacle, not for utility, but for wonder. There were nights when silence itself became part of her performance. She would enter a gathering without a word, moving slowly, her eyes fixed ahead, her animals trailing beside her. Guests would fall silent, their conversations collapsing into whispers until all attention bent toward her. And then, without explanation, she would pass through, leaving behind only the scent of exotic perfume and the lingering sound of feathers brushing against marble. To her, words were unnecessary. Her presence alone was a language, more eloquent than speech. And yet, in the midst of this excess, there were fleeting glimpses of fragility. Those who observed her closely sometimes noted a hollowness in her gaze, as though beneath the layers of costume and paint lay a woman, haunted by solitude. Perhaps in those moments she herself felt the echo of emptiness, the quiet truth that no amount of spectacle could fully silence the ache of mortality. But rather than retreat from it, she confronted it by doubling her inventions, creating ever more elaborate visions, as if to outpace the silence with beauty. Her legend grew. Artists, poets, and designers spoke of her as if she were not a woman at all but a symbol, a manifestation of decadence, a spirit of the age. Young women imitated her fashion, though few dared to carry it to such extremes. Men spoke of her in hushed tones, half mocking, half reverent. She was scandal and inspiration, muse and warning. In her, the contradictions of Europe at the dawn of the 20th century found expression. Its longing for beauty, its hunger for spectacle, its unease with tradition, its fascination with ruin. The cry of the peacock rises again, cutting through the night, a sound that is both harsh and beautiful, both jarring and enchanting. It echoes across her gardens, across the salons filled with masks and feathers, across the city streets where her leopards prowl. It is the sound of her life at its height, when excess seemed endless, when every night was a theater, when the Marchesa Luisa Casati was no longer merely a woman, but a living work of art. And yet, as the sound fades into the silence of the garden, one cannot help but wonder, how long can such brilliance burn before it consumes itself? The feathers settle, the candles flicker low, the animals retreat into shadow. Somewhere in the distance, laughter fades, leaving only the echo of a peacock's cry suspended in the night. The faint echo of laughter fades, trailing off into the silence of salons left half-lit, where glasses stand, abandoned on marble tables, and masks lie discarded upon velvet chairs. It is in this quiet after the revelry that whispers grow louder, whispers of affairs, of fleeting passions, of scandals that fluttered through the air like moths drawn to flame. For Luisa Casati was not only a hostess of eccentric nights, she was a woman who drew others to her, who inspired desire and unease in equal measure. Her beauty was never conventional, nor her allure gentle. She seduced less with tenderness than with the aura of mystery, the sense that to approach her was to approach fire. Men and women alike found themselves entangled in her orbit. There were poets who fell under her spell, intoxicated by her strange presence. There were painters who did not merely paint her but adored her, their brushstrokes trembling with fascination. There were aristocrats and wanderers, dandies and dreamers, each of whom carried away from her a fragment of myth. Some nights she gave herself freely, her affairs conducted openly, as though fidelity itself were a costume she had chosen not to wear. Other nights she remained aloof, her eyes distant, her words veiled in riddles. Desire was never stable around her. It flared, it burned, it consumed, and then it vanished. One of her earliest entanglements was with the poet and playwright Gabriele D'Annunzio, a man as flamboyant in letters as she was in life. He called her Corée, evoking Persephone, queen of the underworld. He admired her daring, her strangeness, her ability to shock. Together they whispered in gardens heavy with jasmine, their words thick with the scent of both devotion and rivalry. For D'Annunzio was himself a performer, a manipulator of myth, and in Luisa he found both a muse and a mirror. Their intimacy was never merely physical, it was theatrical, ritualistic, filled with gestures and words designed to elevate desire into art. Some say their bond was tempestuous, others say it was tender, but all agree it was marked by intensity, the kind that leaves scars long after the body forgets. Yet D'Annunzio was not the only one. Lovers passed through her life like actors moving across a stage. Some were remembered by name, others forgotten, their faces blurred into the haze of memory. For her, it was not permanence she sought, but the fleeting intoxication of passion, the affirmation that her allure could unsettle, could dominate, could inspire. She seemed to treat desire as she treated fashion, something to be invented, displayed, discarded, and reinvented again. Society was scandalized, of course. To flaunt one's eccentricities in dress was one thing, but to live one's passions openly was another. Aristocratic women muttered disapproval behind painted fans. Men gossiped in clubs, half in envy, half in disdain. Yet even as they whispered against her, they longed for invitations to her gatherings, for glimpses of her eyes across a crowded room. Scandal, after all, is its own form of magnetism, and Luisa wielded it deliberately. She did not hide her lovers, nor did she excuse herself. She allowed rumor to become part of her legend, another layer of the mask she wore so skillfully. It was not always triumph, however, for in the wake of passion often comes emptiness, and Luisa knew this well. There were mornings when the revelry had ended, when the lovers had gone, when the peacocks had retreated into silence, and she was left alone in vast rooms filled with the scent of extinguished candles. In those moments one imagines her standing before a mirror, her painted eyes staring into their own reflection, asking silently whether beauty and desire can ever fill the hollow that loss carves into the heart. Did she believe love was possible for her, or did she see it always as a performance, an illusion as fleeting as the shimmer of sequins under candlelight? Yet even in such solitude, she did not retreat. If one affair ended, another began. If one lover left, another arrived. She seemed to live by the rhythm of desire's rise and fall, not fearing its impermanence, but embracing it as part of the spectacle. Just as she reinvented her image nightly, she reinvented her bonds, refusing to be fixed, refusing to be tamed. Her very inconsistency became part of her allure. The echo of laughter, faint though it was, carried with it the memory of these entanglements. Guests at her gatherings would recall glimpses of her slipping away into shadowed corridors, the sound of whispered words, the sight of hands brushing in passing. They would retell these fragments with embellishment until fact and rumor became indistinguishable. Perhaps she encouraged this, for in the haze of gossip, her legend grew larger. To be whispered about was to remain unforgettable. But scandal is a double-edged sword. Though it brought her attention, it also isolated her. Friends could never be certain whether they were confidants or spectators. Lovers could never be certain whether they were cherished or merely part of the performance. And Luisa herself may never have known the answer, for she lived always in the tension between authenticity and artifice, between sincerity and spectacle. To ask whether she loved truly or only performed love is perhaps to misunderstand her entirely, for in her world, performance was truth, and spectacle was sincerity. The laughter fades completely now, leaving behind only silence and the memory of glances exchanged in candlelight. In that silence there is both longing and unease, for the affairs of Luisa Casati were never simple romances, but enactments of something larger, the desire to turn even love into art, to make even passion a stage upon which she could reinvent herself once more. And so the faint echo dies away, replaced by the sound of something else, the dripping of wax from candles that burn too long into the night, falling slowly, silently, marking the passage of hours that could never be reclaimed. The dripping of wax continues, slow and steady, each drop falling into silence like a clock without hands, measuring not minutes, but the slow exhaustion of flame. Around Luisa Casati, candles had always burned late into the night, their light casting shadows that multiplied her image against velvet curtains and marble walls. Yet as the wax thickened and hardened, another truth became clear. Her life itself was a candle, consumed by the fire of spectacle, leaving behind traces of beauty in the form of hardened remnants, fragile and strange. It was in this period of her life that her obsession with spectacle deepened into something nearly religious, as though she believed herself chosen to make existence into theater, to turn her homes into temples where ordinary time could not intrude. Guests who stepped across her thresholds were met not with familiar drawing rooms or orderly parlors, but with dreamscapes, curated tableaux where everything carried the air of ritual. A grand staircase might be lined with animal skins, their glass eyes glinting in the flicker of torchlight. Rooms might be filled with draped fabrics in colors so bold they seemed to pulse under candlelight. Crimson, indigo, gold. Statues, both ancient and newly commissioned, stood side by side, their marble forms mingling with taxidermied beasts, while mirrors multiplied the spectacle, bending light until the space itself seemed infinite. She was no longer content to adorn herself. She adorned entire spaces as extensions of her body, her imagination, her will. One evening, her guests found themselves in a dining room where the table was set, not with flowers, but with peacock feathers arranged in tall vases, their iridescent eyes shimmering in the glow of candelabra. Another night, she hosted a gathering where live snakes slithered across tables, their scales catching light as guests recoiled and then drew closer, unable to resist the uncanny beauty. In her Venetian palazzo, she placed taxidermied lions at the ends of corridors so that visitors, half drunk and already unsettled, would suddenly confront beasts frozen in eternal prowl. Each event was more than entertainment. It was performance, and every guest was both participant and audience. She understood instinctively what the avant-garde artists of her time would later theorize, that art could escape the frame, could become immersive, could engulf the senses. She did not need manifestos. She simply lived it. But with spectacle came cost. The more elaborate her visions, the more money drained from her fortune. Each candle burned was another coin, each taxidermy commission another dent in her inheritance, each costume another stone placed upon the fragile altar of excess. And yet she did not stop. She seemed incapable of calculation, or perhaps unwilling to allow numbers to intrude upon vision. What were debts compared to the immortality of a single unforgettable night? What was bankruptcy compared to the glory of being remembered forever as the woman who dared to turn her life into theater? Those who knew her well spoke of the quiet intensity with which she planned these events. Though she gave the impression of effortless eccentricity, behind it was a mind always arranging, always envisioning. She knew the exact moment to appear, the precise lighting that would transform her from hostess into apparition. She orchestrated silence as carefully as music, ensuring that guests fell quiet just as she entered, their eyes adjusting to the shock of her presence. Nothing was accidental, even her silence was crafted, a pause in which meaning thickened. Yet the more she built these worlds, the further she drifted from ordinary existence. Daily concerns, letters, accounts, responsibilities seemed trivial, laughable. Servants struggled to maintain order in the chaos of her demands. Creditors sent letters that went unanswered. Her daughter, Christina, lived apart, and their relationship remained distant, another silence in the Marchesa's life. Perhaps in her pursuit of grandeur, she abandoned intimacy, finding it easier to fill halls with masks and statues than with conversation or care. The dripping wax, after all, left little room for softness. Still, those who entered her homes were transported. Artists spoke of her salons as otherworldly, places where the boundary between reality and dream dissolved. Writers left inspired, their pages haunted by images of snakes, feathers, shadows, and the pale figure of Luisa herself, gliding silently through it all. She was both the creator and the creation, both priestess and sacrifice. For every spectacle consumed her a little more, carving away at fortune, at reputation, at stability, leaving only the legend intact. Was she aware of the destruction she wove alongside the beauty? Or did she choose not to see it, preferring to believe that ruin was simply another layer of the art? To live in spectacle is to refuse permanence, to accept that everything burns down eventually. Perhaps she believed that even her own collapse would be part of the performance, another act in the endless play of her becoming. The wax continues to drip, thickening into small, hardened pools, reminders of flames that once leapt brightly. Guests depart, their minds full of visions they will never forget. The rooms grow still, the animals retreat into shadow, the masks hang silent upon the walls, and in the quiet that follows, Luisa sits alone, her painted eyes reflecting the last glow of the candles. Around her, the rooms echo with the memory of spectacle, but also with the emptiness that follows excess. Outside, the night is vast and silent, indifferent to the dramas within. But within the walls of her palaces, the Marchesa continues to dream, to plan, to prepare for the next night, the next act, the next creation. the dripping wax falls one last time, and the flame dies, leaving only smoke curling upward, vanishing into darkness. In that smoke, the next moment already waits. The rustle of pages, the sound of words written by a poet who saw in her both muse and mirror. The rustle of pages drifts softly through the air as though a hidden breeze has stirred a book left open upon a table. It is the sound of words written long ago, verses that carry weight beyond their ink. And it is from this sound that we enter one of the most curious and revealing chapters of Luisa Casati's life. Her bond with the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, a man whose own legend intertwined with hers like ivy, clinging to stone. If her homes had become theaters of the bizarre, it was with D'Annunzio that her life became dialogue, for he too lived as if existence were meant to be staged. They met at the turn of the century, when D'Annunzio was already infamous for his writings and his scandals. He was a master of language, of seduction, of spectacle, a man whose appetite for women and for art seemed insatiable. To him, the Marchesa was not merely another socialite, nor simply a wealthy eccentric. She was an incarnation of the very ideas he cherished: beauty as ritual, life as art, desire as theater. He named her Corée, after Persephone, the queen of the underworld, as if to suggest that she belonged not to this realm of sunlight and propriety, but to the shadowed depths where desire and death converse. Their relationship defied ordinary categories. Was it an affair of the body, a union of minds, or a rivalry of egos? It was all and none of these. Together they spoke in riddles, exchanged letters thick with metaphor, and indulged in rituals that blurred the boundary between love and performance. One evening, it is said, she appeared before him draped in nothing but a mantle of pearls, her pale skin glowing in the dim light. Another time, she recited his verses aloud, her voice slow, deliberate, turning his words into incantations. To D'Annunzio she was muse and mirror, someone who reflected back to him the decadence he sought to embody. To her, he was both partner and rival, a man whose hunger for spectacle matched her own, though his weapon was language where hers was silence and vision. Yet their bond was not harmonious. Two such egos cannot merge without friction. At times they adored one another, feeding upon each other's excess. At times they competed, each seeking to outdo the other in audacity, in invention, in scandal. Their intimacy was charged with both admiration and envy. Perhaps that is why it endured, not in stability but in continual reinvention, like a fire that never settled into coals but always flared anew. The letters between them survive, fragments of a conversation both tender and theatrical. In them, D'Annunzio writes of her as goddess, as phantom, as eternal flame. She responds with brevity, with enigmatic turns, as though refusing to give herself fully, even on the page. To read these letters is to enter a world where love is inseparable from myth, where affection is wrapped in metaphor, where even longing becomes performance. One wonders if they ever spoke simply, or if every word was always part of the spectacle. But perhaps simplicity was never the point. In their union, sincerity was expressed through exaggeration, truth revealed through artifice. For Luisa, this was not falsehood, but a deeper honesty, a way of living that acknowledged the impossibility of separating reality from image. With D'Annunzio, she could be herself precisely because she could also be her invention, and he, in turn, could revel in her as proof that his visions were not only literary, but living. Society observed their bond with fascination. Two figures so notorious, so eccentric, so unwilling to conform, seemed destined to collide. Gossip magnified their every gesture. Did he write poems in her honor, or did she inspire entire plays? Did she sleep in his villa, her eyes painted even in the dark, or did she slip away like a shadow, leaving him with only scent and memory? No one knew for certain, and the ambiguity only deepened the legend. Yet behind the myth, there must have been moments of quiet when the rustle of pages replaced the noise of parties, when the two of them sat together in rooms filled with books, candles, and silence. Perhaps in those moments, stripped of performance, they glimpsed one another not as Marchesa and poet, but simply as Luisa and Gabriele, two restless souls burdened by the weight of their own inventions. Did they find comfort in such moments, or did the silence itself frighten them, reminding them of the emptiness that spectacle sought to cover? The question lingers unanswered, like an unfinished verse left on a page. What is certain is that their friendship, their affair, their rivalry, whatever name one gives it, left marks on both. For Luisa, D'Annunzio affirmed her conviction that life could be art, that excess was not madness, but revelation. For D'Annunzio, Luisa embodied his literary fantasies, proving that myth could step out of books and walk in living form. Her eyes lined with kohl, her body adorned in impossible attire. Together they blurred the line between literature and life, between performance and passion. But like all flames, theirs could not burn endlessly. Over time, their paths diverged. He pursued other women, other scandals, other stages for his ambitions. She sought other artists, other canvases upon which to project herself. Yet the bond was never entirely severed. In later years, they still exchanged words, still acknowledged one another as fellow architects of myth. Even in distance, they remained entangled, like characters in a play whose roles cannot be erased. The rustle of pages fades, the sound of letters folded and sealed, of poems written and left unfinished. In its place rises another sound, the sharp crackle of a camera flash, the sudden burst of light capturing her image once more, as she became the muse not only of poets, but of painters, sculptors, and photographers across Europe. The sharp crackle of a camera flash cuts through the air, sudden and blinding, leaving a momentary ghost of light imprinted upon the eye. In that brief explosion of brightness, her figure is fixed, her pale skin and shadowed eyes arrested in silver grains, her presence captured, yet never truly contained. For if the painters of Europe had already begun to immortalize Luisa Casati, it was the camera that multiplied her image, scattering it into new forms, making her both immediate and eternal. The early 20th century was an age of invention, of electricity and machines, and in this age she found herself once more at the center of vision. Photographers gathered to catch her shifting faces, though none ever claimed to have captured the whole. Baron Adolf de Meyer, with his elegant lens, framed her in soft shadows, her body elongated into dream. Man Ray, master of the surreal, found in her a subject who seemed already to belong to his world of strangeness, her eyes glowing with otherworldly darkness, her figure at once statue and flame. Mariano Fortuny, the designer whose pleated fabrics caught light like rippling water, draped her in gowns that seemed made for her alone, and in photographs she became more than model, more than woman. She became the fabric itself, alive and flowing. To be photographed is to risk reduction, for the lens freezes what is fluid. But with Luisa, the opposite occurred. Each photograph seemed to reveal not a singular woman, but a different incarnation, as though she had stepped into yet another self for that fleeting instant. One image shows her severe, her gaze piercing, her body cloaked in velvet as though she were an empress of shadows. Another shows her adorned with feathers, her eyes wide and strange, as if she were bird and woman both. Another still catches her in white, pale, and spectral, less human than apparition. Each was true, and yet none was whole. Designers, too, drew from her, finding in her daring a fountain of possibility. Paul Poiret, master of exotic and theatrical silhouettes, saw her as the embodiment of his visions. Loosened corsets, flowing gowns, turbans, and veils. She did not merely wear his creations, she inhabited them, transformed them, turned fabric into character. She was at once muse and accomplice, pushing fashion further into the realm of art. Others imitated, yet none could match the way she dissolved herself into costume until the line between garment and body was erased. Writers followed the same path, their pages haunted by her image. Some likened her to a witch, others to a goddess, others to a ghost of antiquity returned to wander modern streets. She appeared in novels thinly veiled, in poems scarcely disguised, in gossip columns made mythic by her presence. Her name became shorthand for decadence, for excess, for the strange and beautiful danger of living as spectacle. What did it mean for her to see herself scattered across so many mediums, each reflection both faithful and distorted? Perhaps it affirmed her belief that she was more than flesh, that she had succeeded in becoming an idea, a vision greater than any single self. Yet perhaps it also deepened the hollowness. For to see oneself so endlessly refracted is also to realize that no one truly sees the whole. Did she ever feel lost among her own images, unable to find where the original ended and the reflections began? The camera flash leaves its afterimage long after the light has vanished. Perhaps she too felt herself lingering, suspended between visibility and absence. She was not merely sought out by artists, she sought them as well. For she understood that her immortality lay not only in the memory of those who saw her in salons and streets, but in the permanence of canvas, film, and print. She cultivated these relationships with the precision of an alchemist, offering herself not as patroness, but as material, a living subject more compelling than marble or pigment. She became indispensable to those who sought to capture modernity's strangeness because she embodied it. Yet with every image, every portrait, every photograph, the tension between presence and absence grew. To be everywhere, in paint, in print, in gossip, in fashion, is also to risk being nowhere. She was always changing, always elusive, ensuring that even those who thought they knew her could never grasp her fully. In this way, she protected the core of her mystery, even as she gave away countless fragments of herself. Society could not decide whether to revere or ridicule her. Some saw her as the pinnacle of decadence, the embodiment of a new aesthetic age. Others dismissed her as a frivolous eccentric, a woman squandering her fortune on costumes and performances. Yet even her critics contributed to her legend, for to speak against her was still to keep her name alive. She had achieved what so many seek: inevitability. To discuss modernity, one had to invoke the Marchesa Casati, and yet behind this proliferation of images, one senses the solitude that persisted. To be muse to so many is also to be possessed by them, to have one's image claimed and remade endlessly. Was there ever a moment when she longed to be seen not as art, but simply as Luisa? Or was that desire absent from her entirely, replaced by a conviction that she was only real when transformed, only alive when invented? The photographs offer no answer, only silence, their frozen images unable to speak the truth of the living woman who stepped away from the flash. The crackle of the camera fades, leaving behind only the faint hum of silence in the studio, the smell of chemicals, the shuffle of papers where images dry. In that stillness, the next transformation already waits, the flicker of gaslight in mirrors where she confronts her own reflection, not as muse to others, but as artist of herself, creating the endless tableau of the living work of art. The flicker of gaslight trembles in mirrors, doubling and tripling the flame until the room seems filled with restless fire. Shadows lean across velvet and marble, and in the glass, the reflection of Luisa Casati stares back at herself. She lingers before the mirror not as a woman adjusting her gown before stepping out, but as an artist confronted with her own canvas. The face in the glass is both her own and not her own. For with each line of kohl, each powdered layer of skin, each feather, jewel, or veil, she alters the boundaries of her being. In that flickering reflection, she becomes what she has always longed to be, mutable, ungraspable, alive not in ordinary life, but in endless transformation. This period of her life was marked less by the company she kept than by the devotion she gave to her own invention. She had long been a hostess, a lover, a muse, but now she set herself firmly at the center of her own creation. She was not merely subject. She was artist, sculptor, painter, costume designer, and stage director all at once, with her own body as medium. To powder her skin into spectral pallor was not vanity, it was performance. To encircle her eyes with darkness was not cosmetic, it was ritual. To drape herself in pearls or feathers or veils was not adornment, it was metamorphosis. Guests who saw her emerging from chambers prepared for gatherings often felt the shock of encountering not a person but a vision. There were evenings when she appeared entirely in black, her face pale as marble, her eyes hollow pools, her silence heavy enough to unsettle a crowded room. Other nights she arrived shimmering in metallic threads, her body gleaming like liquid silver under torchlight, her movements fluid and strange. There were times she painted her skin with crimson or gold, times she crowned herself with plumes or horns, times she carried live animals as though they were jewels. Each transformation was complete, never repeated and never explained. The flickering gaslight made these appearances all the more haunting, for gaslight is never still. It trembles, it flickers, it casts shadows that breathe. To see her in such light was to doubt one's own eyes, to wonder if she were flesh or apparition. Mirrors multiplied this uncertainty. In her Venetian palazzo, mirrors stood at angles that reflected her into infinite selves. A guest might see her once in the room and then dozens of times in the glass, each image slightly altered, each an echo of the original, each suggesting that the true Luisa was lost somewhere between reflection and reality. Her obsession with self-creation deepened into something almost spiritual. She did not speak of religion, nor did she bow to the conventions of morality, but in her rituals of adornment and appearance, one can sense a devotion as profound as prayer. The act of becoming was her liturgy, the mirror her altar, the gaslight her flame. She sought not salvation in the next world, but transformation in this one, to ascend beyond the ordinary by sheer force of vision. And yet, such devotion is not without cost. Those who knew her spoke of her detachment from daily life, her growing inability to function within the practical world. She was consumed by the act of becoming, and everything else, letters, accounts, obligations, even relationships, faded into shadows. Her fortune thinned further under the weight of endless costumes, jewels, and theatrical inventions. Servants fretted, creditors circled, yet she continued undeterred. What use was money if it was not transfigured into art? What use was wealth if it could not sustain the fire of invention? To her, ruin was preferable to ordinariness, and poverty preferable to invisibility. But solitude crept into the gaslit rooms. Behind the brilliance of her appearances, there were nights when she sat alone, staring into the mirror long after the guests had gone, her reflection stripped of costume, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Did she recognize herself then, or did she only see another mask, one she had not chosen? The silence of such nights must have pressed upon her heavily, the echo of dripping wax and flickering light, reminding her that no spectacle can last forever. Perhaps it was then that she realized her art was also her prison, that to live as a vision is also to lose the comfort of being simply human. Still, she never surrendered. The mirrors continued to multiply her, the gaslight continued to flicker across her face, and each night she stepped into the role anew. She seemed to believe that identity was not fixed, but infinite, that one could dissolve and reappear endlessly, that the self was not a singular truth, but a theater of shifting masks. To her guests, she was mystery incarnate. To herself, perhaps she was both mystery and answer, both question and silence. The flicker of gaslight trembles once more, casting her reflection into strange distortions, elongating her form until she seems taller, stranger, more spectral than before. In that trembling flame, she watches herself vanish and reappear, as though rehearsing the eternal dance between presence and absence. The room is filled with her image, yet none of them can be held. And from that flicker comes the sound of water, the gentle dripping of a fountain in her Venetian palazzo, where beauty and decay mingle in the scent of stone and moss. The dripping fountain sounds in the courtyard of her Venetian palazzo, each drop falling into water darkened by time, the surface broken by ripples that fade into stillness. It is a sound both soothing and melancholy, the rhythm of a house alive with history, yet slowly decaying beneath the weight of its own magnificence. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, as it was called, stood unfinished for centuries along the Grand Canal, a vast marble body without its head, abandoned by its builders yet destined to shelter legends. When Luisa Casati claimed it, she saw not incompletion but possibility. Its ruins, its raw walls, its air of suspended grandeur, all matched the vision she carried within herself. Here she created her greatest stage, her most elaborate theater of the self. The rooms were cavernous, their ceilings high enough to swallow echoes whole, their windows opening upon the canal where gondolas drifted silently at night. Into these spaces she poured her imagination without restraint. Marble floors were covered with carpets woven in strange patterns, walls hung with tapestries heavy with exotic motifs, staircases guarded by taxidermied beasts whose eyes caught the light of torches and seemed alive again. Statues stood in corners beside Egyptian relics and skulls of animals, arranged not in scholarly order, but in theatrical juxtapositions, as though time itself had been folded into spectacle. Her courtyard became a garden of contrasts. Fountains dripped into basins overgrown with moss, exotic plants stretched their roots into Venetian soil, and peacocks roamed freely, their feathers brushing against ancient stone. At twilight, when the last rays of sun caught the water, the place seemed enchanted, a dream suspended between splendor and ruin. Guests invited to the palazzo often found themselves unsettled, as though they had stepped into a realm outside time. Was this a palace, a menagerie, a theater, or a tomb? No one could say, for it was all of these at once. The palazzo reflected not only her imagination, but her own condition. For Luisa herself was both splendid and decaying, both glittering and haunted. As she filled her home with treasures, she also revealed her obsession with mortality, with beauty that faded even as it dazzled. Taxidermy was not a decorative indulgence. It was a meditation on life and death, on the possibility of preserving beauty even as time devours it. Animals that once prowled or soared now stood silent, frozen in postures of eternal display. Did she see herself in them? Preserved in the portraits, the photographs, the gossip, her image alive though her body must one day fall silent? The dripping fountain seems to answer. Yes, she knew. Nights in the palazzo were spectacles unrivaled by any stage in Europe. Masked balls unfolded in rooms lit only by candles, their flames mirrored endlessly in glass and polished stone. Musicians played in hidden alcoves, while dancers moved in strange costumes, their shadows stretching like giants across the walls. Luisa would appear at the height of the night, sometimes descending the staircase draped in jewels and veils, sometimes gliding across the marble in silence, a leopard at her side, its eyes glowing in the dimness. Guests felt themselves actors in her vision, compelled to participate in a dream not their own. And yet, amid all this, there was a constant undertone of decay. The palazzo itself, unfinished since the 18th century, bore the marks of neglect. Cracks in the marble, dust gathering in corners, drafts seeping through high windows. No matter how many treasures she brought into its halls, the structure itself whispered of incompletion, of impermanence. Perhaps this is why she loved it so fiercely, for it mirrored her philosophy. Beauty must not deny decay, but embrace it, must shimmer against the certainty of decline. Those who visited left unsettled. Some whispered that the Marchesa was mad, that her palazzo was a house of nightmares. Others proclaimed it genius, the dwelling of a woman who had transcended taste to reach the pure realm of art. Artists adored it, finding in its strangeness a reflection of their own longings. Ordinary society, however, remained divided, half fascinated, half horrified. But Luisa did not build for them. She built for herself, for the myth she was weaving night after night, candle after candle, mask after mask. It is said she once declared she wished to be a living work of art. In the Palazzo Venice dei Leoni, this wish came closest to realization, for there, her life and her home fused into a single performance. She was the subject, the space, the spectacle, the silence. The dripping fountain was her heartbeat, the peacocks her chorus, the shadows her companions. Yet, as always, extravagance carried its shadow. The cost of maintaining such splendor grew heavy. Creditors became more insistent, servants more anxious. Whispers of financial ruin drifted through the candlelit halls like drafts of cold air. Still she pressed on, refusing to let reality intrude upon vision. Perhaps she believed the palazzo itself would protect her, its grandeur too vast to collapse, its legend too enduring to vanish. But marble cannot pay debts, and legends cannot silence bankers. Already, in the midst of her most glorious creation, decline was waiting at the threshold. The fountain dripped still, each drop echoing in the courtyard, a reminder of time's patience. For water wears away stone, as surely as ruin wears away fortune. And as the sound lingers, mingling with the cries of peacocks in the twilight, one begins to sense that the next act of her story is approaching. The quiet dread of creditors, the slow erosion of wealth, the locked doors of rooms no longer hers. A locked door waits at the end of a corridor, its iron key turned by unseen hands, its silence heavier than the echoes of laughter that once filled those rooms. The sound of that bolt sliding into place carries more than finality. It is the measure of wealth, dwindling, of debts accumulating, of spaces once her own now sealed away by creditors. In the Palazzo Venice dei Leoni, where fountains dripped and peacocks cried, whispers of ruin grew louder than music, shadows of unpaid bills longer than the flicker of candles. For even an inheritance as vast as Luisa Casati's could not withstand the relentless hunger of spectacle. By this time, her fortune, once one of the greatest in Italy, had thinned like wax, burned too long into the night. The cost of costumes, jewels, animals, servants, and endless performances gnawed at her estates, while bankers and agents pressed for repayment. Yet she seemed unable or unwilling to temper her ways. To live modestly would have been to betray the very art she had become. For her, every dinner was a stage, every gown a painting, every night an act in a theater that could not be abandoned. And so the debts grew, as inexorable as the tide rising against Venetian walls. Visitors who continued to attend her gatherings began to notice small shifts. The extravagance was still present, but there were cracks in the surface. Servants looked uneasy. Supplies were strained. Rooms fell into disrepair. Yet Luisa herself maintained her appearances with the same intensity. Her costumes no less daring, her presence no less commanding. It was as though she believed she could will away ruin by sheer persistence of vision. But creditors do not bow to vision. They tally numbers, they count losses, they calculate. And so the palazzo that had been her greatest stage became also the stage of her decline. The whispers reached beyond Venice. Society, once dazzled, began to murmur of irresponsibility, of folly, of madness disguised as art. Some said she was merely eccentric, unable to manage what had been given to her. Others, harsher, declared her reckless, squandering a fortune on vanity. Yet those who had witnessed her creations knew the truth was more complicated. She was not wasting wealth aimlessly. She was spending it as an artist spends paint, as a composer spends notes, as a poet spends words. The difference was only that her medium was life itself, and her currency not imagination but gold. Still, even art must confront the mundane. Letters arrived daily demanding payment. Estates were sold to cover debts. Auctions loomed in the distance like storms gathering over calm waters. And through it all, Luisa continued her rituals. She painted her eyes, powdered her skin, draped herself in veils and jewels. If ruin was approaching, she would meet it adorned, not diminished. To cease was unthinkable, for to cease would be to admit that she had ever been ordinary. Better to fall in splendor than to fade in modesty. There were moments of desperation, though she revealed them rarely. At times, friends caught glimpses of weariness in her eyes, a heaviness in her voice when she spoke of the future. But even in such moments, she disguised vulnerability with performance. If she confessed to fear, it was in the form of metaphor, a riddle of masks and shadows. Perhaps even to herself, she could not admit plainly the truth of her decline. The mirror remained her refuge, where she could paint over dread with the certainty of appearance. The locked doors multiplied. Rooms that had once been filled with music and laughter stood empty, their treasures sold or claimed. The corridors grew darker, the echoes fainter. The palazzo that had seemed infinite with spectacle began to shrink under the weight of absence. Guests noticed the difference. Some continued to attend, loyal or curious, but others drifted away, unwilling to associate themselves with scandal or ruin. What had been the center of fascination now carried the scent of tragedy, the aura of collapse. And yet, in a paradox that seemed to define her life, her legend grew even as her fortune declined. The very news of her debts, her auctions, her losses, became part of the myth. She was no longer merely the woman of spectacle, but also the woman undone by spectacle, the figure who proved that beauty and ruin were inseparable. Artists still adored her, seeing in her decline not failure but proof of devotion to her vision. Writers continued to draw upon her as symbol, not of moderation but of excess, of daring, of the refusal to compromise. The locked door stands still in memory, its silence echoing louder than music. Behind it lies not only a room, but a chapter of her life now sealed away, possessions lost, treasures dispersed, memories dissolved into the hands of strangers. Yet even in the face of this, Luisa did not retreat. She moved onward, seeking new spaces, new stages, new cities where she could continue her performance. If Venice closed its doors to her, Paris would open another. If the palazzo was lost, the world itself would become her theater. The sound of the lock fades into distance, replaced by another silence, heavier, emptier. A hall stripped of its furnishings, a chamber echoing with footsteps that do not belong to her. In that emptiness, we glimpse the next act, the great auctions where her possessions, fragments of her legend, would be carried away piece by piece, leaving her with only the memory of what she had created. The silent echo lingers in empty halls, where footsteps now belong not to guests in masks or servants bearing trays of wine, but to strangers who arrive with ledgers, gloves, and quiet determination. These halls, once alive with feathers and laughter, now stand stripped of their enchantment, waiting to be divided. It was in these spaces that the Marchesa's possessions were gathered, catalogued, and prepared for dispersal, the great auctions that would scatter her legend into fragments across Europe. Each object, once chosen with precision and imbued with her presence, was now reduced to a number on a list, a lot in a catalog, an item to be bid upon. Imagine the scene, heavy curtains drawn back to reveal rooms emptied of their illusions, chandeliers unlit, mirrors clouded, carpets rolled away. The taxidermied beasts, once part of her theater, stood mute and awkward, their glass eyes reflecting not candlelight, but the pale glow of winter sun. Statues wrapped in cloth awaited removal, their forms hidden, their silence accusing. Even the peacocks, restless and bewildered, cried into the emptiness, their voices echoing through the courtyards like lamentations. The auctions became events in themselves, attended by collectors, aristocrats, artists, and the merely curious. Catalogs circulated, listing the extraordinary array of her belongings: gowns shimmering with sequins, cloaks of feathers, jeweled collars, masks, veils, headpieces adorned with horns and wings, paintings and sketches depicting her by Boldini, Van Dongen, Brooks, and others hung for the last time in her possession, soon to be claimed by hands that admired not only the art, but the scandal it embodied. Exotic relics, Egyptian artifacts, Venetian treasures, even the very furnishings of her palazzo, all were placed on display, ready to be dispersed. For those who had once attended her salons, the sight was unbearable. To see the Marchesa's life, once so carefully woven into spectacle, reduced to lots and numbers, was to witness the undoing of a myth. And yet, paradoxically, the auctions only deepened her legend. Buyers clamored not simply for objects, but for fragments of her aura. To own a cloak of hers was to own a piece of living theater. To acquire a portrait was to claim a piece of myth. Even in dispersal, she was irresistible. It is said that at times she herself attended these sales, drifting through the rooms like a ghost at her own funeral, her eyes painted, her presence both defiant and mournful. To watch strangers carry away her treasures must have been agony, and yet perhaps also a kind of vindication. For the very frenzy with which her possessions were claimed confirmed her power. Even in loss, she inspired desire. Even stripped of her palazzo, she remained unforgettable. Each object carried memory. The jeweled leash that once led a leopard down a Venetian street, the cloak that shimmered under torchlight, the mask that hid her eyes during a midnight ritual. As they passed into other hands, they carried with them whispers of her nights, fragments of her legend. Scattered though they became, together they ensured her myth would not vanish. No single person could contain her now. She had become dispersed across the world, alive in fragments, eternal in pieces. But for her, the emptiness must have been unbearable. To return to halls stripped bare, to hear only the echo of footsteps, to see the fountain drip into silence without the shimmer of jewels or the cries of birds. This was a wound deeper than scandal. She had lived by creating environments of wonder, by surrounding herself with visions that dissolved the ordinary. Without them, she stood naked against reality, the illusion broken, the theater dismantled. The silence must have pressed upon her like a weight, reminding her of mortality, of the impossibility of sustaining endless transformation. Yet even here, amid ruin, she refused surrender. If the palazzo was lost, there were still other cities. If the objects were gone, she would invent anew. Her imagination was not tied to possessions alone. It was a force that could not be auctioned. She gathered what remained and moved forward, carrying her vision into exile. Paris would see her next. then other cities, each receiving her as both fallen noblewoman and undiminished apparition. The silent echo in the halls grows softer, fading as the last crates are carried out. The last hammer falls, the last receipt is signed. Strangers depart with treasures wrapped carefully, leaving the palazzo hollow, its grandeur reduced to stone and dust. In that emptiness, the legend of Luisa Casati is both diminished and magnified, her possessions scattered, but her myth secured. The silence that follows is vast, but from it rises another sound, the toll of a church bell through Parisian fog, marking the hour as she drifts alone through streets, far from Venice, her figure now more spectral than ever, her fortune gone, but her presence undimmed. The toll of a church bell rolls through fog, each vibration heavy and slow, as though time itself has thickened in the damp Parisian air. Its sound follows her as she walks, her steps uncertain, her garments no longer the silks and sequins of Venice, but remnants of past splendor repurposed into eccentric disguises. She is exiled now from her palazzo, her fortune scattered like feathers in the wind, yet the Marchesa Luisa Casati does not vanish. Instead, she drifts from city to city, carrying with her the aura of her former grandeur, even when only tatters remain. In Paris, she walked the boulevards at twilight, her eyes still ringed with black, her hair arranged in wild coronets, her body swathed in layers of fabric that no longer matched, but still shimmered with fragments of old enchantment. Strangers turned their heads, some in curiosity, others in mockery, but none indifferent. For even in poverty, she radiated something unyielding, something that refused to be subdued by circumstance. It was as though she had decided that if she could no longer live as a queen of palaces, she would reign instead as a ghost of the streets. Friends and admirers remained, though fewer than before. Artists welcomed her still, for they understood that decline itself could be beautiful, that poverty could be made into theater just as wealth had been. In salons of Montparnasse, she appeared like a relic of another age, yet one strangely in harmony with the surrealists and dreamers who sought to disrupt ordinary reality. They saw in her a forerunner, a woman who had long ago declared life itself a performance. Her eccentricity, once called scandal, now seemed prophetic, but she was also lonely. The exile that gave her freedom also left her unmoored. She moved from boarding houses to rented rooms, from borrowed apartments to borrowed gowns. Her daughter Christina remained distant, her family ties long severed, and lovers drifted away like smoke from extinguished candles. She belonged to no one, not even to herself, for she had given herself away to legend. The church bell tolls through fog as she walks, its sound reminding her of transience, of the end that approaches no matter how stubbornly one paints over its shadow. Still, she refused surrender. If she could no longer host balls in palaces, she would host spectacles in the very act of walking. To see her on a gray Paris morning, her garments mismatched, yet layered with imagination, was to glimpse a procession no less theatrical than her Venetian masquerades. She carried with her strange animals still, though no longer leopards on jeweled leashes, but dogs dressed in ribbons or birds perched upon her shoulders. Even poverty could be turned into performance, and she embraced it with the same conviction as wealth. Other cities received her as well. In Berlin, she was remembered drifting through cafes like a phantom draped in veils. In London, she walked the streets by night, her face pale beneath lamps, her silhouette elongated by shadow. Each city added to her myth, whispering stories of her strange appearances, embellishing details until they seemed impossible. Did she truly attend parties in rags painted with glitter, or was this invention of gossip? Did she truly wear light bulbs as jewels, or was it metaphor? The line blurred, as it always had with her, between fact and legend, and perhaps she encouraged it, for ambiguity was her greatest ally. Artists of the avant-garde embraced her once more. The Surrealists, with their love of dream and distortion, saw in her not decline but revelation. They painted her anew, photographed her anew, wrote of her as if she were a saint of spectacle. Coco Chanel, though a very different kind of woman, acknowledged her influence on fashion, admitting that the daring freedom of the Marchesa had helped break old boundaries. She was no longer at the center of society, yet she remained at the edge of vision, always present as a figure who had lived ahead of her time. But exile is never easy. Nights were often cold, meals uncertain. She pawned what remained of her jewels, sold sketches and gowns, relied upon the kindness of friends. And yet, even in this fragility, she found ways to turn suffering into theater. She painted her eyes darker, powdered her face whiter, exaggerated her gestures further. If ruin threatened to strip her, she would clothe herself in ruin itself, making decay into costume, poverty into art. Few could endure such a life, but for her it was the only way to remain true to the vow she had lived since youth, to be a living work of art, no matter the cost. The toll of the bell lingers through fog, its sound receding yet echoing still. She pauses, her breath visible in the damp air, her body trembling beneath layers of tattered finery. Around her, Paris moves indifferently, carriages and cars passing, pedestrians hurrying, shopkeepers closing shutters. Yet she is not invisible. Eyes turn, whispers follow, stories begin anew. The woman who once hosted leopards in Venetian palaces now drifts through Parisian fog in borrowed gowns, but her gaze is unchanged, her eyes still lined with the black fire that unsettled and enthralled. And so she walks onward, the sound of the bell fading, replaced by the faint fragrance of roses wilting in a nearby stall, their petals already curling, their scent sweet but fleeting. It is this fragrance that ushers us into her next encounters, with a younger generation of designers and dreamers who recognized in her not only a relic of the past, but a muse whose influence would linger like perfume, even as the roses themselves withered away. The perfume of fading roses lingers in the air, their petals bruised and curling, their sweetness deepened into something almost mournful. It is in this fading fragrance that Luisa Casati moved among the new generation, the designers, artists, and poets who saw in her not a ruin, but a revelation. Paris was alive with change, its streets crowded with fashions newly simplified, its cafes filled with voices declaring the old world dead and a new world struggling to be born. In this landscape, the Marchesa appeared both out of place and yet strangely central, a bridge between the extravagance of the fin de siècle and the daring inventions of the modern. Coco Chanel, austere and sharp, embodied an opposite vision to Luisa's. Where Luisa adorned herself in feathers, jewels, and theatrical excess, Chanel stripped fashion down to clean lines, dark fabrics, restraint. And yet Chanel herself acknowledged a debt to the Marchesa. For even minimalism requires something against which to define itself, and it was women like Casati who proved that a woman could be her own invention, her own creation, unmoored from tradition. Chanel is said to have remarked that without the Marchesa's daring, her own revolution would not have been possible. The roses faded, but their scent lingered, just as Louisa's excess remained the unspoken shadow behind modern simplicity. The Surrealists, too, embraced her. André Breton, Salvador Dalí, Man Ray. These men who sought to unshackle art from reason found in Luisa an ancestor of their dream. She had long before them declared that life itself could be art, that spectacle could dissolve the boundaries between waking and dream. In her eccentricities, they saw not madness, but vision, the same impulse that led them to paint melting clocks, to write automatic poems, to photograph shadows as though they were more real than bodies. To them, the Marchesa was a living surrealist work, wandering the streets of Paris draped in improbable garments, her eyes outlined in black, her presence both absurd and transcendent. Man Ray's camera returned to her, not to capture her former splendor, but to explore her strange endurance. He photographed her in moments of decline, her face older, her attire more tattered, yet her gaze no less piercing. These images became icons not of beauty in the conventional sense, but of persistence, of devotion to art, even amid ruin. For the Surrealists, she was proof that art was not about polish or perfection, but about intensity, about living in ways that unsettled the ordinary. Young designers, too, looked at her with awe. Elsa Schiaparelli, with her bold experiments in fashion, saw in Luisa's costumes a precedent for garments that blurred the line between clothing and sculpture. Others studied her fearlessness, her refusal to be bound by taste, her insistence that the body itself was a stage. Even in rags she inspired, even in exile she influenced. The perfume of the roses lingered, though the petals fell, and so too her influence remained, though her fortune had dissolved. But influence is not the same as comfort. For Luisa herself, these years were fraught with hardship. Invitations still arrived, but they came tinged with curiosity rather than reverence. Some welcomed her as muse, others as relic. In gatherings of artists she was adored, but in society at large she was often mocked, pointed out on streets, whispered about as a fallen eccentric. Yet she carried herself with the same dignity, or perhaps the same defiance, as always. She painted her eyes blacker, her face paler, her garments stranger, as though to insist that she would not vanish quietly into conformity. If she could no longer dazzle with wealth, she would dazzle with audacity. There were moments, too, when she seemed to relish her new role as living ruin. Where once she had shocked by appearing in gold and feathers, now she shocked by appearing in patched garments painted over with glitter, or gowns so frayed they became artworks of disintegration. She turned poverty itself into costume, as if to declare that even loss could be aesthetic. In this, she was ahead of her time, anticipating an age that would see beauty in the broken, the fragmented, the incomplete. Still, loneliness haunted her. The surrealists admired, the designers borrowed, but few stayed. Lovers were gone, family estranged, friends scattered. She had become a muse more than a companion, a symbol more than a woman. And perhaps she accepted this as destiny. For to be a living work of art is also to be forever separate, never fully touched, never fully known. The perfume of roses fades into air, leaving only the memory of sweetness and the ache of loss. Yet even in decline, she cast shadows longer than those of her peers. Chanel, Schiaparelli, Dali, Man Ray, they would endure in history, but always with the Marchesa, hovering at the edge, the figure who walked leopards in Venice, who draped herself in jewels, who turned her life into theater. She had become a legend before her death, and her legend only grew in these years of fading roses. The last petals fall now, their edges browned, their fragrance faint. In the silence that follows, the whisper of autumn leaves stirs in London streets, where her final years would unfold in poverty, yet with the same strange dignity. Her eyes painted still, her body draped still in whatever fragments of theater she could assemble. The whisper of autumn leaves stirs along London streets, brittle and pale, caught in the chill wind that winds between terraced houses and soot-darkened walls. Among these leaves walked Luisa Casati, her figure still unmistakable, though diminished, her garments patched and layered, her plumes bent, her jewels replaced with trinkets of little value, yet carried with the same solemnity as crowns. London was her final exile, the city where the last act of her theater unfolded, a stage stripped of grandeur, but not of presence. She lived in small lodgings now, rooms far from the palaces of Venice or the salons of Paris. The wallpaper was peeling, the floors worn, the ceilings low. Her fortune was gone, her possessions dispersed, her debts unpayable. Yet even here she continued her ritual of invention. Each morning she painted her eyes in the same heavy kohl, whitening her face until it glowed with spectral pallor. She adorned herself with scraps of fabric, ribbons, feathers found or gifted, arranging them into costumes that transformed poverty into display. Neighbors, accustomed to the ordinariness of London streets, watched her pass with astonishment. Children whispered that she was a witch. Men shook their heads. Women smiled or scowled, yet no one failed to notice. She remained what she had always been, unforgettable. Her eccentric dignity was not diminished by hardship. If anything, it was sharpened. To see her walking through the fog, draped in rags painted with glitter, was to see not defeat, but defiance. She refused to bow to the world's expectation that poverty meant invisibility. Instead, she turned ruin into spectacle, carrying herself with the same posture as in her days of wealth, her chin lifted, her gaze unflinching. In her, one could see the strange beauty of endurance, the dignity of someone who had chosen always to live as art, even when the canvas was torn. Friends still visited, some out of loyalty, others out of curiosity. Artists in London whispered of her. Writers recorded impressions of her strange appearances. They found her sitting in her room, surrounded by odds and ends, scraps of fabric, broken ornaments, a few books, fading photographs. She spoke little of regret, less of despair. Instead, she remained enigmatic, her words wrapped in metaphor, her silence as eloquent as ever. To those who had known her in splendor, the contrast was startling, yet they also sensed continuity. For the woman who now painted her eyes in a small rented room was the same who once led leopards through Venetian palaces. The stage had shrunk, but the performance endured. There were evenings when she walked the streets alone, her garments trailing in the wind, the leaves scattering around her. Londoners rushing home from work paused to watch. Some laughed, others crossed the street uneasily, but all carried away the image. To glimpse her in those moments was to glimpse not merely eccentricity, but the persistence of myth in flesh, the refusal to fade into anonymity. Even in the dim light of street lamps, her eyes shone with the same fire that had unsettled Rome, Paris, Venice. Yet behind the spectacle, her poverty was real. She struggled to afford meals, relied on the kindness of friends, and pawned the few trinkets that remained. At times, she wore the same garments for weeks, repainting and rearranging them until they seemed new. Still, she carried herself with the same assurance, as though every choice, even necessity, was part of her art. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she had long ago blurred the line between survival and performance until there was no difference. It is tempting to see these years as tragic, but to do so is to misunderstand her. For though she suffered hardship, she never surrendered the essence of her vision. She had always claimed her life as art, and she remained faithful to that claim until the end. If art is to create beauty from ruin, vision from despair, then her final years were art indeed. The leaves whispered along London streets, and she whispered with them, her footsteps echoing not with defeat, but with strange, quiet triumph. In these years, she became almost spectral, a ghost wandering among the living, already half in memory. Writers noted her presence in cafes, in markets, in theaters, describing her as apparition rather than woman. She had become what she had long sought, a myth living in the present, a story told even before its ending. Children pointed, adults whispered, but she was never ignored. To see her was to remember her, and to remember was to continue her legend. The autumn leaves scatter further now, lifted by wind into the distance. Among them she moves, her garments fluttering like wings, her face pale beneath the gas lamps, and in that movement there is both fragility and strength, both ruin and resilience. The whisper of leaves fades, replaced by the softer sound of a single candle being extinguished. For her life was drawing to its close, her body weary, her resources exhausted. Soon she would slip from presence into absence, from theater into silence, leaving behind only memory and myth. A single candle is extinguished, its flame folding in upon itself before releasing a thin thread of smoke that drifts upward and vanishes into the shadows of a rented room. In this fragile silence, the final act of Luisa Casati's life took shape, not upon the marble staircases of palaces or in the glow of 1,000 candelabra, but in a modest London lodging where poverty pressed upon her and solitude became her truest companion. Her days of masquerades and jeweled leashes were far behind her, yet even here, in obscurity, she remained faithful to her invention. She continued to live not as an ordinary woman, but as art. She had little left, few possessions, fewer coins, fewer friends who still called upon her. Yet each morning she carried out the ritual that had defined her life. She powdered her skin until it gleamed with pallor, darkened her eyes into pools of shadow, and arranged her hair into wild coronets. Her garments, patched and frayed, were layered into eccentric assemblages that transformed necessity into spectacle. A ribbon here, a feather there, a scrap of sequined fabric repurposed into a sash. To a stranger, she might have appeared pitiable, but to those who looked closer, she remained unmistakable, a figure who refused erasure. Neighbors whispered of the strange woman who wandered the streets, dressed as though for a masquerade no one else attended. Some children laughed and called her a witch. Others watched in awe as she passed like a ghost trailing colors against the soot of London fog. Shopkeepers shook their heads yet remembered her long after she was gone. Even in decline, she stirred the same mixture of fascination and unease that had followed her in Venice, Paris, Rome. For hers was a presence that could not vanish quietly, a presence that drew attention like flame draws moths. Her poverty, though severe, did not extinguish her imagination. If she lacked jewels, she painted imitation ones upon her garments. If she lacked gowns, she fashioned costumes out of discarded fabrics, painting or stitching them into new life. She walked the streets as though still parading through salons, though her stage now was cobblestone rather than marble. She lived on the edge of survival, yet she clung to her vow to be a living work of art until her final breath. And then came the end. On June 1st, 1957, in her small lodging, she died quietly. The candle extinguished, the performance stilled. There were no leopards at her side, no masked guests awaiting her entrance, no peacocks crying in distant gardens. Only silence, only the thin air of London pressing against the walls of a modest room. For a woman who had filled Europe with spectacle, the simplicity of her death was almost shocking. Yet perhaps it was fitting. For what greater contrast could there be than this? Her life a torrent of excess, her death a whisper. She was 76 years old. Time, which she had tried so long to defy with spectacle, had claimed her at last. Yet even in death she refused to abandon art. She had left instructions that she be buried not in mourning black, but dressed in her own eccentricity, her eyes still painted, her body adorned, and so she was placed into the ground in Brompton Cemetery, wearing a black and leopard print coat, false eyelashes, and clutched in her hands, not a rosary, but the stuffed body of a small Pekingese dog. To some it seemed grotesque, to others poignant, but to all it was unmistakably hers, her final act in a life of theater. The funeral was modest, attended by few, yet it was remembered precisely because of her strange attire. Even in the anonymity of death, she remained unforgettable. Visitors to her grave still speak of the irony and the dignity of it, that she who had lived so flamboyantly should rest among ordinary stones, yet in garments that proclaimed her refusal to ever be ordinary. She was buried beneath the earth, but the legend walked on above it, carried in whispers, in stories, in portraits and photographs. Her death did not end her presence, it transformed it. For those who had known her, she became a memory at once haunting and inspiring. For artists who studied her image, she became an archetype, a muse whose scandal and spectacle revealed truths about beauty, desire, and ruin. For the curious who read of her life, she became a figure of fascination, a woman who dared what others would not, who burned through fortune and reputation to carve her name into legend. The candle is gone now, but its smoke lingers faintly in the air, twisting like a veil before dissolving into nothing. And in that smoke, one can almost see her silhouette, tall, adorned, eyes dark and luminous, a leopard at her side, feathers trailing, jewels glinting. Not as she died, but as she lived, as she wished to be remembered, as a living work of art, a scandal, a mystery, a flame. The silence of her room remains, yet from it another sound arises, the soft rustling of silk remembered, fabric shifting as though in dreams, reminding us that even in absence, she continues to move, continues to unsettle, continues to inspire. The rustling of silk remembered moves faintly through the air, though no fabric lies upon the floor, no gown sweeps past the threshold. It is the echo of memory, the sensation of her presence long after her body has been lowered into the ground. For Luisa Casati did not vanish in death as ordinary mortals do. She entered instead a stranger afterlife, not of heaven or repose, but of legend and art, where her name became a talisman for extravagance and her image an endless mirror for imagination. Artists kept her alive first, for they had always understood her as more than flesh. The portraits remained. Boldini's swirling brushstrokes, Van Dongen's saturated hues, Romaine Brooks's austere palette. These works, already treasured, acquired new weight after her passing, for now they were not mere likenesses, but relics, icons of a woman whose existence blurred into myth. Collectors spoke of her name with reverence, buyers sought her image with hunger, and museums displayed her face to generations who had never seen her in the flesh, but who recognized immediately that this was no ordinary sitter. The Surrealists carried her further, writing of her as though she were one of their own creations. For Dali, Breton, and their circle, she became a figure who had anticipated their dreamscapes before they had painted them. Her life was itself surreal. The leopards on diamond leashes, the masquerades of feathers and jewels, the snakes coiled around her neck as though she were priestess and altar both. To them she was not eccentric but prophetic, a reminder that the unconscious, the uncanny, the irrational could take shape in daily life. Fashion, too, refused to forget her. Designers looked to her as patron saint of daring, of spectacle, of fearless invention. Chanel may have pared garments down to austerity, but she acknowledged that it was women like Casati who proved that clothing could be identity, costume, performance. Elsa Schiaparelli went further, finding in the Marchesa's outrageous combinations a precedent for her own designs that blurred clothing and sculpture. Even in later decades, echoes of Casati appeared on runways. Dramatic eyes, animal prints, silhouettes exaggerated into the realm of theater. Each revival was less imitation than invocation, a calling forth of her spirit to remind the living that beauty need not bow to moderation. Writers, too, returned to her again and again. Biographers chronicled her rise and fall. Novels borrowed her figure thinly disguised. Poets evoked her as symbol of decadence, of ruin made luminous. Her name entered the language of metaphor. To call someone a Casati was to conjure extravagance, mystery, scandal. Yet none could quite agree on who she had truly been. Was she heroine or cautionary tale, genius or fool, prophet or madwoman? The ambiguity was part of her power, for she refused in life to be one thing, and so in death she remained many, each interpretation true and false at once. Even the places she once inhabited seemed haunted by her absence. The Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, once echoing with her peacocks and fountains, became in later years the site of another legend when Peggy Guggenheim transformed it into a museum of modern art. Visitors wandered its halls and could not help but think of the Marchesa, who had once filled them with taxidermy and torches, her presence lingering like smoke in the marble. The house became a temple to art, and in its foundation lay the memory of the woman who had tried to live as art herself. Her grave in Brompton Cemetery attracted pilgrims, curious admirers who brought flowers, who left tokens, who whispered stories of her final act. To stand before the stone was to feel the strange contrast between the modest marker and the legend it concealed. Some laughed at the stuffed Pekingese buried in her arms. Others wept at the thought of her poverty. Still others stood in silence, imagining the flame she had once carried. Death could not erase her theater. It only relocated it into memory, into legend, into myth. And in myth, she grew larger. Each retelling of her life added new flourishes. Some swore she once wore light bulbs as earrings, others that she painted her body entirely in silver. Some said she prowled streets at night with tigers, others that she dined by herself at tables set for 20, each place laid with flowers. Fact blurred into invention until the truth mattered less than the aura, the sensation that she had lived as no one else dared. In this sense, she succeeded more fully than she ever could have imagined. For to be remembered in myth is to escape the finality of death. The rustling of silk continues faintly, as though generations later she still passes by, her gowns brushing against the air of galleries, her feathers catching the dust of libraries, her eyes glimmering from photographs. She is invoked by artists, admired by designers, whispered about by those who seek to live differently. Even in an age of shifting images and fleeting spectacles, she endures as symbol, as question, as challenge. What does it mean to turn life into art? And what is the cost of such transformation? The silk fades into quiet now, but in its place a mirror appears, clouded with dust, reflecting not her image but ours. For as her legend grows, we are left not only to admire, but to ask what her choices reveal about our own. Was she liberated or imprisoned, visionary or lost, or all at once? The dust upon the glass waits to be disturbed, to reveal her presence again in the reflections of those who dare to look. A mirror clouded with dust stands in a quiet room, its surface dulled so that faces appear only faintly, blurred outlines, shapes without certainty. In such a mirror, one might glimpse the Marchesa not clearly but as suggestion, as possibility, as myth refracted. And so it is with her legacy. No matter how carefully one wipes the glass, the image remains obscured, subject to interpretation, never whole. For Luisa Casati became in death what she had been in life, not a fixed truth, but a shifting vision, a story retold in countless ways, each as revealing in its invention as in its fidelity. To some, she is remembered as a cautionary tale. They point to her squandered fortune, her estranged family, her lonely death in a rented room. They say she is proof of the danger of excess, of the futility of spectacle, of the emptiness that lies at the heart of extravagance. They see her as a woman undone by her own hunger, a moth who flew too close to the flame she herself had kindled. In their telling, she is tragedy, her beauty collapsing into ruin, her art consuming her life until nothing remained but ashes. To others, she is celebrated as a visionary. They look at her not as ruin, but as revelation, a woman who lived before her time, who declared with her very body that identity is invention, that life itself can be art. They see her influence in fashion, in performance, in the very idea of self-creation that now feels commonplace. They call her muse not only for artists of her age, but for all who followed, for every designer who dares excess, every poet who courts scandal, every soul who refuses to be ordinary. In their telling, she is triumph, her ruin not failure, but sacrifice, her poverty not humiliation, but proof of devotion to her vision. Still others hold her in ambiguity, refusing to define her as either failure or prophet. For they sense in her a tension too deep to be resolved. She was both extravagant and fragile, both brilliant and reckless, both free and bound. They see her life as a mirror itself, reflecting not answers but questions, asking each who looks upon her, what is the cost of beauty? What is the value of spectacle? What does it mean to choose myth over comfort, vision over safety, art over life? To them, her story is less about her than about us, about the choices we make in the face of time, mortality, and longing. The dust upon the mirror thickens even as hands reach to wipe it away. Each historian, each biographer, each artist who revisits her adds their own reflection to hers. Some emphasize her eccentricities, turning her into caricature. Others emphasize her artistry, making her into saint. But perhaps the truth lies not in any single account, but in the very impossibility of clarity. She remains elusive because she intended to be so. She built herself not as statue, but as flame, flickering, shifting, never fixed. Consider again her childhood, the orphaned silence of marble rooms. Was it grief that drove her to spectacle, a hunger to drown sorrow in beauty? Or was it destiny, the inborn fire of a soul unwilling to submit to ordinariness? Consider her marriage, her affairs, her salons, her decline. Was she seeking love, immortality, distraction, or simply the thrill of invention? Each answer is partial, each interpretation true and false at once. She lived in contradiction, and contradiction became her essence. Even her decline resists clarity. Was her poverty, humiliation, or final performance? To walk London streets in patched garments painted with glitter, was this desperation or audacity? To be buried with false eyelashes and a stuffed dog, was this grotesque parody or perfect fidelity to her vision? The mirror, clouded with dust, gives back no single answer, only the faint outline of a woman who refused to be defined. And so her meaning depends on the eyes that behold her. To the pragmatist, she is folly. To the dreamer, she is liberation. To the artist, she is muse. To the moralist, she is warning. To history, she is all and none, a ghost shimmering between fact and myth. Perhaps this is why her story endures, because it cannot be settled, because it continues to provoke, to unsettle, to inspire. A settled story fades into the past, but an ambiguous one lingers, alive in the imagination of each generation. The mirror stands still, dust settling again upon its surface, blurring the faint outline of her eyes. And yet, if one looks closely, if one tilts the glass toward the trembling light, a suggestion emerges, not of answers, but of endurance. She remains, not because she was virtuous or victorious, but because she dared. She dared to live in scandal, to create herself nightly, to turn ruin into theater. She dared to be unforgettable, and in this she succeeded. The dust thickens once more, but behind it the light shifts, fading toward dusk. In that dimming light the room falls quiet and the silence grows as night approaches. And with night comes the closing of the story, the gentle meditation on beauty and ruin, on memory and forgetting, on the endurance of those who choose to burn brightly, even at the cost of consuming themselves. The silence of nightfall arrives unresolved, soft yet immense, spreading across the world like a cloak. In that stillness, shadows lengthen until they seem to swallow the last traces of day, and memory itself becomes the only light. It is here, in this lingering quiet, that the story of Luisa Casati settles, not in conclusion, for she defied endings, but in meditation, in the slow rhythm of thought drifting between beauty and ruin. She has passed into the realm of myth, yet myths never close. They hover, waiting to be retold, reshaped, reinterpreted. Her life was a flame that burned not for warmth, but for brilliance, a candle set not to endure, but to dazzle in its brief intensity. She knew the cost of such burning, yet she chose it willingly. Others preserved their fortunes, their reputations, their respectability, and passed into quiet graves. She spent everything, her inheritance, her love, her body, her sanity perhaps, on the creation of an image that endures beyond her flesh. Was it folly or genius? Was it madness or art? The silence of nightfall gives no answer. It simply holds the question, as gently as the darkness holds the stars. What remains of her is not merely the record of her deeds, the facts of inheritance, marriage, scandal, exile, and death. What remains is atmosphere, the shimmer of jewels beneath candlelight, the cry of a peacock in twilight gardens, the rustle of feathers brushing marble floors, the gaze of eyes painted black as midnight. What remains is sensation, half dream, half memory, carried through time like perfume long after the roses have withered. In this sense, she triumphed. For who among us, when we are gone, will leave behind not only names and dates, but visions, questions, atmospheres? Who will be remembered not only for what they did, but for what they dared to imagine? She chose to live as a living work of art, and though the cost was great, her vision was realized. To this day, her presence lingers in galleries, in fashion runways, in whispered stories. She is invoked not as example, but as challenge, reminding us that life is not only to be lived, but to be shaped, sculpted, invented. Yet her story is also caution, for beauty cannot shield against hunger, nor spectacle against loneliness. She burned too fiercely to leave room for tenderness, too extravagantly to preserve comfort. In her refusal to compromise, she sacrificed peace. To admire her is also to mourn her, to recognize the hollowness that followed her through gilded rooms and empty corridors alike. She is at once inspiration and warning, a figure whose brilliance and fragility cannot be separated. And so we sit with ambiguity, with a legend that refuses to resolve. Was she free or trapped? Was she heroine or fool? Was she liberated in turning her life into theater, or imprisoned by the very masks she created? Perhaps the truth is all of these at once, for human lives are not singular stories, but braids of contradiction, and hers more tightly woven than most. The night holds her contradictions without judgment, allowing them to shimmer like constellations, whose meaning depends upon the eyes that gaze upward. Night deepens, and with it, memory softens. One imagines her walking once more through Venetian palaces, leopards at her side, jewels catching torchlight, eyes dark and endless. One imagines her drifting through Parisian fog, garments patched, but aura undiminished. One imagines her in London, frail yet still adorned, children whispering in awe as she passes. These visions overlap, blur and dissolve, leaving behind only the certainty that she was seen, and that being seen became her immortality. The silence of nightfall remains unresolved, just as she remains unresolved. Yet perhaps that is the point. To be unresolved is to remain alive in memory, to resist closure, to linger in the imagination. Luisa Casati lived her life as art, and art never ends with neat answers. It lingers, unsettles, inspires, and troubles long after the curtain falls. So too with her. And so, kind listener, as you drift now toward sleep, carry with you the image of her eyes, dark, luminous, unflinching, set against the silence of night. Let them follow you into dreams, not as answers, but as questions. What does it mean to live fully? What does it mean to sacrifice for beauty? What does it mean to choose spectacle over safety, myth over comfort? In her life lies no single truth, but in her myth lies possibility, the possibility that even ruin can shimmer, that even solitude can be theater, that memory itself can be art. The night grows deeper still, its silence thick with stars unseen yet felt. Somewhere in that silence the Marchesa walks on, her footsteps light, her garments trailing, her gaze unbroken. And though her candle has long been extinguished, its smoke lingers, curling into the endless dark, refusing to fade,